So good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable. Welcome to those who are new to our little group, and welcome to those who've been here before and have come back. It's lovely to see so many faces right at the beginning, and inevitably, I know there's a few people who are going to be joining us as we continue through. For those who don't know me, my name's Matthew Baird. I've been doing social housing recruitment now for 11 years. I set up on my own 2.5 years ago as an independent recruiter, and had a client nickname me the ethical social housing recruiter, and have put that on every business card and every piece of propaganda I've had going out since. A lot of that came from the way I recruit, which was not just putting EDI at the heart of stuff, but actually finding out about culture, and that being the main source of recruitment, but also because of running events like this and putting the social housing roundtable together without charge, joining the Springboard and becoming co-chair of that board, and just trying to realize that every penny that you guys pay me in a recruitment fee is tenants' money, and knowing that you're doing something with that. So that's the birth of the Social Housing Roundtable. We've held many events this year. I didn't mean to count before, but I haven't quite got that yet. I know we did 48 in 2022, so I wanted to try and do 50 this year, but I think we'll just miss out. But still, it's going well. Delighted today to have two co-hosts with me, who I've met I met both kind of one via conference, and then I met Naomi through Peter, even though I think Naomi and I were connected on LinkedIn probably for a little while. So Peter I met originally via LinkedIn, and then at the CIH conference, and I was on his podcast a little while ago. So I'm delighted to say that he's returned the favour and come onto the roundtable today. If you don't know Peter, he's over with Voicescape, who, if you don't know Voicescape, then you should, basically would be my answer. He's their sales director, and I'll get him to introduce a bit more about himself and everything that they're doing very, very shortly. And then I've got Naomi Sweeting with me. So I've done some work with Grand Union. I think a couple of people from there have been involved in the roundtables before, but Naomi and I hadn't met. She's the director of customer experience, and have met you a couple of times on Zoom. I know it's going to be a really, really interesting session today, because when we were trying to put together what the topic was going to be, sometimes a longer title confuses people. But I think that idea of embedding inclusion as a service design principle through data, it was almost kind of 3 parts, but all were absolutely imperative to trying to kind of change what the social housing world is and what we're trying to do with it at the moment. So without further ado, I'm going to pass over to Naomi, who's going to have some slides and share about 3 years worth of slides in about 20 minutes. I know there's a lot to try and get through. So I'm going to pass it over to you. Then we'll have Peter going through his part. Just a very, very quick bit of the word will come to me in a minute. But if you have questions at any point, please put them in the chat. I'll happily bring those in. And then once the presentations are over, we'll be a more open discussion. But if you have points, thoughts, ideas during it, put them in the chat. But for now, Naomi, over to you.
Lovely. Thank you, Matt. Good morning, everybody. So as Matt said, I'm currently Director of Customer Experience for Grand Union Housing Group, and I've worked in social housing now for about 5 or 6 years, but my background prior to that has been in lots of different sectors, really sort of in sort of multiple sort of different roles, but really fundamentally looking at insight and data, so customer insight. Used to work for an agency sort of delivering a lot of customer improvement, customer measurement sort of tools for various different sectors. I've also worked for central government, and I've also worked for financial services and also higher education, sort of to name but a few. So got quite a broad sort of bandwidth kind of experience over different sectors. And when I first joined housing, so you'll kind of probably sort of see from this, I'm always quite kind of honest. I kind of try not to be controversial. I always feel like I have to caveat everything I'm going to say with, controversial statements, but it's in the interest of challenge and improvement and getting us to really sort of question how we've done things and do we need to do things differently sort of moving forward. So it's meant in that sort of spirit, really sort of question and challenge ourselves. But I was really quite shocked, if I'm honest, at what was happening in social housing. I felt like I was back in 1992 in quite a dysfunctional organisation in the way that customer service was being delivered, and really felt that we lacked some of those fundamental foundational business tools that sort of every other sector has. So sort of embarked on sort of looking at how we could do things differently, which sort of led to this piece of work that I'm going to sort of take you through. It is a lot. I've tried to really condense it down. I'll try not to speak too quickly. But you will get the slides afterwards. But apologies if it feels like it's a bit of a run through, but because it is. So I will just share my screen with you and hope that you can all see it. I'll just check. Can everybody see that?
Yeah, that's great.
Perfect. Okay. I'll just try and put that in slideshow as well, so it's a bit more visual for you. Okay, perfect. So this is really about considering your whole service design and really kind of using, as Matt sort of said, kind of inclusion as a kind of fundamental principle. And I'll sort of say a little bit about what I mean by that as I go through. So really, this is about taking a whole person approach to your service delivery. I think certainly in terms of segmentation, which this is about, when I started in housing, people were dabbling in segmentations a little bit, and people were saying, oh, well, it hasn't really done anything. We had a segmentation, didn't really do anything for us. And invariably that's because they did the sort of wrong segmentation. Segmentations kind of have different sort of approaches you can take. And what I thought I saw in housing at the time was people were following either a demographic segmentation or kind of a life stage segmentation, but it doesn't tell you anything. So it was the wrong segmentation, you know, knowing that you've got a group of customers who are within a particular age bracket and have a smartphone and, you know, shop in a certain supermarket doesn't tell you anything. So it didn't have the value that organizations wanted. So people kind of felt it didn't have that value. Other segmentations I saw were looking at sort of what I call kind of what was happening, so that situation. So they kind of described something that was happening, but didn't tell organizations why. So again, we're quite limited. So it was that sort of situational analysis, or we can see that this is happening for this group of demography, but why? You know, why is it kind of actually useful? They didn't know actually what to do with that information or how it could improve the service. So this is really about understanding that whole person in designing your services to meet those needs. And my hypothesis kind of when I joined housing was it kind of occurred to me that I felt that we were probably experiencing more customers in difficulty than you'd see in a general population or a population of a big commercial organization. And certainly in that space around sort of undiagnosed learning disability, cognitive capability issues. And that was the hypothesis at the time that sort of set out to really understand what that looked like and how that translated into needs. And it's really sort of built from quite a lot of psychological theory and also special educational needs theory, actually. So this is a quote from somebody who does a lot of work in special educational needs. And it kind of was fueled really by things that I experience in my personal life. So I have a 17-year-old son who is severely autistic and has additional learning disability and a chromosomal abnormality. I have a daughter who is 18 who has only recently been diagnosed with autism. It presents very differently. I have a husband who is severely dyslexic. But knowing all those things doesn't help anybody. This is not about labeling individuals with specific things. It is equally not about labeling them with a segment in your systems. And I think that's where the sector has gone wrong as well. It's not about kind of labeling, and it is not about personas. And I hear a lot of people talking in the sector about personas. Persona is the least important element of any segmentation. What segmentation is essentially is really rich data that you can use to inform your decisions and inform your processes and service design. But this is predicated in terms of psychographic segmentation on understanding people's needs and capabilities. And I felt, and I still feel, that in housing, we put a lot of resource into trying to cope and deal with problems rather than understanding what's caused the problem. So this will become apparent as I take you through sort of this. We do spend a lot of time, I think, judging customers, blaming customers for not complying with the way we want them to engage with us, rather than actually kind of going, is there a reason why actually the way we've designed the service isn't working for customer, and can we do better? So that's kind of what it's built on, really. Really important to understand that you can't do this through your existing data. This is not data you should hold in your systems. We do not hold it in our systems. This is bespoke research that has around it that kind of governance around Market Research Society Code of Conduct, which protects
Naomi, I
customers.
don't know if you're changing slides. We're still
Oh,
on
I
your
am.
first slide at the moment.
Oh,
So I just thought I'd point out, like, I thought, because when you moved that, I was like going,
I wonder why. So it's showing slide 4 on mine.
ah, right. I did wonder. I was there thinking, I'm pretty sure you're moving
So
through
that's
the
not
slide.
moving at all, is it?
No, with the one it's sharing seems to be your actual PowerPoint
Just my title slide.
title slide. Without it seems to be the actual almost the program itself rather than the slides. I don't know whether or not we need to change the screen you're sharing.
Let me stop sharing a minute.
That's right. I just suddenly thought you were pointing at something. I was like, that's
Yeah, because
the,
it's scrolling through on mine, so that's tricky, isn't it? Let me see.
the joys of Zoom.
Let's try that. Let's see if that's any better. Can you see that?
That seems to be, yeah, change
Is
your
that,
slide.
hang on, no, it's not moving for me. Is that moved?
That's working. Yeah, absolutely brilliant. You're
Okay,
now on
so
the innovation page.
perfect. So now I'm going to like skip over that because I've talked you through that, and obviously I'm not going to do it again. So that's about stopping those demographics. I'll just hold on this slide a minute. That's what I was talking about, understanding those needs. So that's scrolling through now for you, is it?
It is, yeah. Thank you.
Perfect. Apologies for that. It's showing, can't go on my screen. So it's really, as I said, about understanding what's causing a behaviour, not dealing with what the behaviour is. And I think the example I use here is always around messy gardens. We probably all put a lot of resource into kind of dealing with complaints around messy gardens, but it's kind of been built off the back of us thinking that a customer is deliberately not maintaining their garden. And I think we do have to take some responsibility for stigma in social housing by the language we use, by how we've designed our processes, by how we actually service our customers. I think has kind of actually sort of fueled some of that stigma and continues to. And I do think we need to take some responsibility for that sort of in going forward in how actually we've kind of baked some of that into our approaches. So as I said, you have to kind of do this through a piece of bespoke research, really important. Again, the housing sector is the only sector I've worked in that doesn't follow Market Research Society Code of Conduct to protect anonymity and confidentiality, and has created this thing called resident engagement for itself. And I'm just like, what does that even mean? And what we can show through this work is if that's the approach you're adopting, you are only ever going to hear from the most capable and confident customers. And actually you shouldn't do that. If you want to hear from a representative sample and you need to know who your customers are, you need to ensure that you've got that proper governance around it. This had a lot of qualitative work built into it. We should not underestimate the fear that a lot of customers have in talking directly to their landlord, fear of losing their home, fear of retribution. There is a reason why every other sector do not talk directly to their customers. When I was working for Lloyds Banking Group, we didn't have people phoning up customers for their feedback. You have to have that division between kind of delivery and assessment of that, really important. So we worked with some professional agencies. Now, just a little bit about sample size, and this is something really important to understand. And obviously, we're probably all a little bit more in this headspace because of TSM and the technical requirements to deliver that. We achieved a sample of 2,530, which gives us a 99% confidence level. So that means we can be really, really confident this absolutely represents our customer base. And that's only got a 1 to 2% confidence interval as well. So we know that any data point you see is within 1 or 2%. So really important to understand. We know this is really stable and valid. The good thing about psychographic segmentations as well is they are really stable. This is about who people are. It's not those things that happen around you. People do not cycle through those segments. We don't need to keep doing this. And as I said, this is not about labeling your customers individually anyway. But this is something you just need to do at a point in time, and then you can use some of the tools that come out to it to track and see what your different population looks like changing over time, but you do not need to redo this. So really important, and it is something that you might face if you do this piece of work, and it does still make me laugh. When we were in the old world, which we were doing, that kind of engaged customer group of 10 customers, and you'd sit in board meetings and they say, oh, have you spoken to customers? Have you done your customer consultation? And we go, yes, absolutely, tick the box, great. Nobody questioned it, but suddenly when you do something like this, everyone kind of goes, but can we be sure? Can we be sure this is really kind of robust? It's like, yes, you can. For the first time, you can actually know who your customers are, and this can inform how you speak to them too. So what this enables you to do is really move from that old approach, which I think probably you'll all recognise, to a new world. So that old approach is about the asset first, and it's no mystery that our primary systems in housing are housing management systems. They haven't been CRMs. It hasn't been about the customer. It's been about that sort of building that asset. And then what I love about housing is the ability to do things like this, that we can share, we can talk to each other. It's really collaborative. But I think, having worked in other sectors, what's happened a little bit is there's a little bit of a hive mind and there's a little bit of an echo chamber. So we all talk to each other and we're all kind of constrained by some of those sector norms. And we start to panic if we look slightly different, in how smart data and the like, rather than actually considering through data, what do we need to do to run our businesses? I kind of say quite regularly, if we all suddenly started running our businesses as if they were commercial organizations, we'd probably be making different decisions, and that's the space we need to get to. We're all pretty much doing those kind of same service offers. We've got policies which are really binary, and I think that's kind of really prohibited us. Again, when it comes to equality, it's not something until very recently I've heard discussed in housing. We all have a public sector duty under the Equality Act to ensure we design services that meet the needs of any customers with protected characteristics. Now, unless you've done this work, you can't possibly evidence that, because again, I think we're quite myopic in the way we've considered diversity and equality, and we just think of ethnicity, and that's even come through the Better sort of Homes Review, which is a bit disappointing. You cannot pick and choose which protected characteristic you might want to look at on any given day. You have to look at it in the round. And certainly from an equality perspective, if you're operating policies which say yes we do something or no we don't, that isn't inclusion. It is perfectly reasonable to do something for one customer and not for another customer based on those needs. Then we all do our process design based on those internal structures, what's always been. We see massive amount of service failure, and we have got a massive amount of service failure in the sector, which we then blame on customers, non-access, all of these things. They haven't engaged with us, it's the customer's fault. And then we continue as before, and we in that cycle. And then we've separated those other activities. So we've seen like that resident involvement bit is a separate thing. We just talk to them separately. We talk about measuring customer experience, but it's always been like an annual survey and no one's really done anything with it and got very excited if it's gone up 2% or down 2%, none of which is statistically significant. And then ED&I and vulnerability has been seen as a completely separate strand. And I did a workshop with a group of colleagues from different organisations for this work. We're doing this for other people now last week. And it kind of occurred to me within there, some of the reason for that it's not having impact is in some organisations, that whole tenant involvement activity is just seen as the activity and the outcome in itself. It's not being linked to anything. It is just seen as a separate piece. But what this allows you to do is really take that customer first approach and have that continuous ED&I and vulnerability baked into everything you do in the design of your services. So moving to the segmentation itself, it's a really, really robust sort of survey, if for want of a better word, asking lots of questions around who people are, so their daily lives. I'm not going to dwell on this. We don't know what data and what points are going to kind of actually feed into the segmentation when we do this. It's a K-cluster statistical analysis kind of that sits behind it. The data tells you where it lands. Pulling and pushing against each other, you don't know. And as I say, we've now done this for other organizations and it's been the same data that's driven those segments, which is not a surprise because we're all dealing with the same people essentially. So it's really important to understand that this is not us deciding what drives those segments, it's the data that does that. Everything you see is data driven. And what we found for both us at Grand Union, but also the other organisations we've done this for, is it's this whole question set around capability and impact of things affecting you on a daily basis, which is driving the segmentation. So this is massively significant when we talk about equality and diversity. Again, disability is definitely there. We've got all of those other protected characteristics built in. It doesn't tell you anything about what customer needs and it doesn't make any difference. And again, we should not, and I know this flies in the face of some of the guidance in the sector at the moment, we should absolutely not be looking to go out and label our customers with any sort of tags like, can you tell us if, your sexuality, can you tell us your ethnicity? You should not be collecting that data. It's special category data unless it is feeding into something, you're doing something with it. That is a GDPR no-no. And you don't need it. It tells you nothing. So you can report that 6% of your customers are non-binary. So what? Doesn't tell you anything about what they need. So you shouldn't be doing that. This bakes it all in and then they are not the driving data points. But we can see that 72% of our customers have told us they have at least one condition that affects them on a daily basis. That's massive. That's been the same for every organisation we've done this for, between 68 and 79%. We're all in that same ballpark. For ease of analysis and reporting, we've put into 3 broad buckets. They are 3 broad buckets. They are not one thing in itself. We've also got a lot of diagnostic questions to ascertain and really understand the need that sits behind that as well, because it's not about labeling someone, with a specific diagnosis. It's understanding what needs, because that's really detrimental actually to what you're trying to achieve as well. And again, using my kind of own family as an example, so you'd label my 2 children as autistic. They are completely different. And when I look at communication, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, my son cannot talk on the phone to anybody, even me. My daughter loves the phone because actually she finds it difficult dealing with people face to face. My husband is dyslexic. People would kind of go, oh, he can't read. He can read. Actually, he can't process language and he can't use the phone. Doesn't tell you anything about the individual. So you need to design your services in consideration of what might be challenges rather than an individual label. This also starts to dispel some of those myths around kind of who people are and what technologies they use. There's lots of webinars in the sector around digital exclusion, and that is the minority of our customers. What this work shows is that the majority of our customers, and again, it's been the same for all organisations we've done this for to date, are digitally active, digitally capable, and not only want, because this is not about preferences, but need to engage with us and have our services designed in a digital way. So this is about those kind of fundamental needs that people need, and that's really important to understand. That has massive implications for how you're designing things like resident voice as well. Again, there's a lot of dialogue in the sector about your kind of methodology for doing TSM, which I'll touch on briefly at the end, about actually it's not true, and you need to do this work to understand how you should be adopting that methodology. So these are our 6 segments, and broadly speaking, they run from the most capable and confident with deliver and flex through to the most sort of vulnerable, in inverted commas, if you like, sort of in nurture. And we can size those segments so we can see actually what that looks like from a business perspective. Everyone we've done this for today has the same segments. People have different proportions within those groups. So it's important to understand. We've named them to reflect the service that we need to offer to meet their needs. This is not about them as an individual, it's about how we need to kind of design that service accordingly. So I'm just going to take you through 2 of the segments. And the reason I've chosen these 2 segments are these are 2 segments who are far more likely to be in arrears, for example. And this is where you can really start to look at the kind of current processes you're delivering and really understand the impact on any customer who may be in that space. And that's the space we need to get to. I think we're very good in the sector at doing a lot of stuff. We're very activity based. A lot of our KPIs, a lot of that benchmark data is around stuff we do, just counting things rather than really measuring impact and outcome. And you need to understand this is what gives you the information. How do we design that service differently that meets the needs and has the better outcome for both us as a business and also the customer? I'm not going to read the persona, as I said, because it's the least important aspect of the segmentation anyway. But what really defines this segment is the really high levels of anxiety and depression. So we need to adopt much more of a non-judgmental, reassuring and considerate tone. They are financially struggling, but digital first works for this group as well. So just a little bit about this group of people to give you a little bit more depth and understanding. And I'm just going to focus on 2 areas here around health and communication. So they're likely to have health issues, as I said, high levels of anxiety and depression. In terms of the communication style, and this is where you really need to start consider your whole service design. And we've shared this with the Ombudsman, we've shared it quite widely in the sector. In terms of complaints, you are only going to be getting complaints from your most capable and confident customers, typically in that deliver and flex segment. You're never going to hear from this group. They do not have the capability and confidence to do this. And we were sharing this with the Ombudsman to kind of go, we need to get away from just being obsessed with are people adhering to a process. We need to ensure those processes are designed to meet those capability and needs. They equally might have issues understanding communications and written sort of communications. And we love a letter in housing. I've never worked in a sector like it. It's usually 6 pages of incomprehensible kind of language, which I struggle to understand sometimes. I don't understand what it means. So things to consider there. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about the telephone in a minute, but this group find it difficult to use the telephone. I'm going to talk about that in a second. But they have internet access, they have smartphones, and they need to be serviced in that way. If we look at some of the data that sits behind this group, you can see in that sort of pie chart there, the sort of issues that they're really struggling with. So we've got a mix of kind of conditions in that cognitive, mental health and physical health space. When we look at some of those diagnostic questions, you can see that actually we can start to see sort of capability sort of challenges creeping in. So we have a level of literacy and numeracy difficulty. We have a little bit of language processing difficulty. Excuse my cat, by the way, she always does this. And we have some sensory difficulties as well. And when we look at the statements most likely to be associated with them, you can see that they're worried, they're blaming themselves, they find it difficult to ask for help, they can become overwhelmed. If I'd shared with you the deliver segment, that looked very different. They were saying, I feel in control of my life. I'm very happy with life as it is. I find it easy to complain. I'm comfortable dealing with people in authority. But they're not the people who may be accessing this service, especially in arrears, because Deliver are really good money managers. So we need to be considerate of that. We've got lots of information around capability to maintain home. It does impact when you kind of have a capability overlay on ability to maintain home. I'm just going to touch on damp and mold there. We know that an overall figure, we've got 27% of our customers who've told us they have an issue with damp and mold. And it's across all of our segments, but for some segments it's greater. And we know that they're struggling probably to engage or, tell us what the problem is, probably for fear of what we're going to say. And I think we have to take responsibility, because I think if we're all honest, probably a few years ago, we were telling customers that it was a lifestyle issue. We can see 34% of this customer group have told us they've got an issue with damp and mold. Now I'm going to move to nurture, who's our most vulnerable group. They're struggling with multiple issues. These are general needs housing customers. Again, these are not our sheltered or supported customers. They're struggling in multiple areas. We definitely need to have an overall simplicity and service style. There are definitely potential vulnerabilities, and we definitely need to consider those equality considerations. And when you're designing any of your services, again, what you need to consider, and these are 2 good examples, if you design to meet the needs, and again, this is about a capability and needs piece of reassure and nurture, it will work for everybody. So this is not about doing things differently, kind of going, well, do we do this for deliver? Do we do this for nurture? Do we do this for boost? If you design with the most kind of needed kind of customer base in mind, it works for everybody. And that's really important to understand. So again, when we talk about some of those kind of predetermined vulnerability criteria that people have traditionally used, certainly when I first joined housing at the beginning of COVID, everyone was rushing to contact their vulnerable customers being the over 70s. Age is not a determinant of vulnerability. We've got to start looking at it from a needs and capability piece. And you can see this is our most vulnerable group, and they are young, they're of working age. The only segment we have which has more of a demographic element is our flex group, who are of retirement age. They are one of our most capable groups. So we've got to stop with those arbitrary kind of labels that we think kind of tell us anything about a customer, because they don't. This group have multiple health issues, mixed kind of across those criteria. A quarter have cognitive issues. They're likely to have trouble reading, issues with following conversations. Again, they find it difficult to complain. You will not get this group, you'll not get reassure, you will not get assist, you will not get boost for different reasons coming to any of your resident involvement sessions, because you've got barriers to them being able to engage for different reasons. So you have to adopt an approach. You're going to hear them sort of differently, which we've now done. But again, this group have internet access. They want to actually engage with you digitally because it works for them, but they're likely to ignore official communications as well. So again, just looking briefly at some of that data, you can see that 57% are struggling with both physical and mental health conditions, and other groups kind of got a different sort of profile. And this is what we need to understand as well. You know, some of these customers have 5, 6, 7 conditions that they're living with on a daily basis. When we look at those statements, it's even kind of, you know, worse for this group. They're feeling anxious most of the time. They're overwhelmed. They find it difficult to make phone calls. All of those things we need to consider. And when you look at those cognitive kind of capability strands, it's really quite significant. 58% have struggle reading, 56% struggling to understand financial information, high levels of language processing difficulty and sensory difficulties, and it is impacting on their ability to maintain their home as well. So again, if we want to consider our current service offer, so if you're offering things like a voucher for a paint pack, for example, this group are unable to decorate, and we've just done a big piece of work around conditions for home, and that's found that actually 3/4 of our nurture segment are still living in a home that isn't decorated to a standard that makes it a home. So we do need to take some responsibility for that in considering our overall service design. Just this is the last slide, and then I'm just going to show you one more, and then I'm going to hand over to Peter. You can see sort of actually that where we need to really look and focus is on some of those more vulnerable and kind of needs-based capability strands. The way to read these charts are, the white column is our total customer position, and then you read across for each segment. So we can see in terms of conditions, for example, that we know that 29% of our customers have told us they struggle with depression, but it's only 3% of deliver, but it's 91% of nurture. So if you're only hearing from your most capable customers, they don't have the same view of the world and the same experience as some of your other customer groups. This is a really important piece of data in this chart here in terms of cognitive difficulties. So ignoring letters that look official, 10% of our customers say that's the case. So that is a 10% service failure you've got baked in if any of your processes rely on you writing to customers. There isn't a commercial organisation that would tolerate that. That is a huge cost to your business that isn't having the desired outcome. But again, you can see how that reflects differently on different segment groups and capability. It's only 1% to deliver, but it's 43% of nurture. So you're not necessarily designing that process. And then we look at some of those processes. So I always use the example of our electrical safety inspection. When I joined Grand Union, what's our process? Computer says Mrs. Miggins is due her electrical safety inspection. What do? We write to her and tell her we're coming out a week on Tuesday. We don't hear back. What do? We write to her again and tell her we're coming out. What do? We don't hear back. We send an operative out anyway. Bad customer, non-access. You know, we have to take responsibility for that process not meeting the needs of those customers. It could be a customer in Boost who's actually really time poor and hasn't opened the letter because actually they're too busy. I don't open my letters till weeks after I receive them. So we need to think differently. Difficulty making phone calls. Again, a third of the UK population find it difficult to both receive and make phone calls to people they don't know. And we're in line with that sort of third figure. But again, it's only 4% of deliver, but it's 83% of nurture. So again, if your process relies on a customer needing to contact you on the telephone or you contact them, it's not going to work effectively. So if we take that to its logical conclusion from an arrears point of view, if your first point of contact is a letter, might not be opened, or it might not be understood, because invariably it's probably about 6 pages, which kind of then has a whole list of different contacts, which is completely incomprehensible. Again, we need to get better at that. Comms is a really, really important skill set, which has been seen sort of on the periphery in housing organisations. There isn't a piece of communication that leads a bank without it kind of going through rigorous testing and through its marketing capability. I'm really surprised that we're still in the space that anybody and everybody in a housing organisation to write to a customer at any given time. You might be writing to them, another 3 teams may be writing to them at the same time, and it's just lost in the noise anyway. So we need to get better at that. But that's a real challenge for us. So equally then, if you phone a customer, so Martin Lewis has done a lot of work on this. If you have a customer who is significantly struggling with anxiety and depression, and we know for Reassure, for example, who are likely to be in arrears, they are, and you write to them, they may ignore it, they may not be able to take it. If you phone them, they may not answer the call, but if you do, you overlay a bit of debt with anxiety and depression, and then you think a call is going to resonate at a point in the day where that customer is not actually prepared for that call. It's not going to necessarily work. Equally, don't think that the go-to, which some organizations can, we need to go knock on doors. Again, I mean, I'm not sure what you're like, but if someone just knocks on my door randomly, I'm not expecting, I don't take too kindly to it, and people living in quite complex conditions, they would not, the answer is not to go and knock on their door. So there are different ways of doing it. And this is where actually working with Voicescape and Caseload Manager can really help us, because we don't need to know that Mrs. Miggins is in Reassure, but we have the ability to bespoke those messages with a more reassuring tone, actually test what communication channel works for Mrs. Miggins, and actually engage with them in that way, which is really effective. So it's a way of really embedding what we know from a needs and capability perspective into a specific area of our service delivery. I've only got 2 more slides, I promise, and then I'll hand over to Peter. This is important because this really impacts on how you're going to be measured in the future in terms of TSM. So these are our current TSM scores. The first thing I'm going to say is they're really poor, and we have to get really better and be more honest with ourselves as a sector. I always say, if I was in a commercial organisation, if I was back in my Lloyds Banking Group days, for example, and I was sharing this with my exec teams and the board, there would be panic in the room, there would be heads rolling, there would be an action plan in place before people left that room. What we tend to do in housing a little bit is kind of going, but how do we benchmark against Housemark? And the narrative is still there. I think people are fundamentally missing the point of why these measures exist. They are not to make sure that you get the best scores. So when you're compared against the housing association next door, you've done better or worse, and how's that going to be performed? You need to know the truth, because this is the fundamental kind of experience information that you need to feed into your transformation and improvement plan. Now, we could absolutely game this, and I'm going to show you sort of how. The way we're doing it, as I said, we're not tagging customers on systems. We've kind of moved to a completely kind of robust, professionalized customer insight capability, which means we do know who we're talking to. We're hearing from hundreds of customers across segments on a routine basis weekly now. But that's a whole different session, which I'll come back and talk to you about, because there's quite a lot of detail in that. But we can analyze all of our results at segment level. What you can see from this slide, the pink line is our overall average, but those other lines are our segments. So what we can see from this is our more capable and confident segments in Deliver and Flex perform above that line, but our more vulnerable segments fall way below that line. And this enables us to really understand, how do we drive that performance, and what is it that we know from the data that we can improve? Why is it that Nurture and Reassure, for example, are saying that actually it's not working for them in the same way? And we can look at that information kind of going, well, are we writing to them as part of that process? Well, they're not able to engage in that way. So if we redesign that process, we will likely see an improvement, because it will meet those needs. Just a little bit to finish on in terms of the methodology for TSM. A lot of narrative in the sector at the moment about how digital channels attract a negative bias. The first thing to say there is no channel can attract any kind of bias. It just can't happen. You need to know how to reach your customers in the designing of your methodology. And what we can see from this work is, if you're adopting a telephone approach, you are basically not going to be hearing from Boost onwards. So you are only going to hear from Deliver and Flex. We have now evidenced this in our data collection. We do a 90 digital, 10% telephone, because we can see from the data in terms of that digital capability and needs, that's what our customers need. We can now evidence that in the 10% that we've spoken to on telephone, we have only spoken to Deliver and Flex through that channel, who we can see from this are happier. And if we were to do that, our results would be up in the 80 and 90%. So I could totally game it to give us a better score, but it wouldn't be the truth. And that's the point. This is not about trying to get your best scores. It is making sure you have an accurate read on your customer experience, so you can actually improve and demonstrate real improvement and use that information to inform service design. And again, I think we're being a little bit disingenuous if we don't recognize that, because it has to be authentic. If you're getting scores which are really high, and then you're still getting all those complaints around the same issues, and you're still getting all of those issues coming through, it's not authentic. You can see it's not authentic. And again, in a commercial organization, that wouldn't fly in the same way, because you'd be saying, well, why are we losing market share? Why are our customers leaving us? We don't have the same consequence, but we have a moral obligation to do things better for our customers because of that. And we also have an obligation to use their income that we collect from them in the best way to meet their needs. And that's why it's important to design that accordingly. And that's why one of the first things we've done, as well as the resident and voice sort of piece, and completely reimagine that, is partner with Voicescape in the development of that caseload manager process, because we can actually now utilize and embed and implement our arrears management process in consideration of everything we know about our customers. So I'm going to hand over to Peter.
Yeah, please do. I mean, there's a number of questions which I'm going to come back to at the. I know Peter's only got a couple of slides, which I'm going to get Peter to show kind of a little bit about what that Voicescape bit is, and then we'll go to the questions in the chat. But thank you for just a real, true, and honest insight, I would say, into what's going on at Grand Union, and thank you again for just going, actually, that these are our figures. We know they're not good enough. This is where we are, because I think that's going to be where what will be really interesting as the TSM stuff comes out next year. Peter, I'm going to
and I should just say on that, sorry, we've delivered this for 5 other organisations. We're currently doing it for another 4 organisations, and we've been recognised with a few awards kind of in that equality and vulnerability strand over the last few weeks as well, out of sector as well as in sector. But we've collected TSM for those other organisations as part of that process. Everyone is performing in the same ballpark. So those organisations who are saying they're up there, it's not the truth, and we need to kind of have a reality check on that, I think, a little bit. Sorry,
thank you, Naomi. No worries at all. Peter, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Naomi. Thank you, Matt. I'm Peter Hudson. I'm the sales director at Voicescape, and I don't think I could have had a better platform for introducing Caseload Manager to you. I think the work that Naomi, the work that Grand Union are rolling out across the sector, absolutely capture everything we probably knew. You know, we're squidgy human beings. We're not binary. Nobody's the same, and the fact that, you know, for the last God knows how many years, we've been trying to put people into rigid buckets, recognizing that actually we're probably not delivering the best service that we could. And it's, you know, recognition of that that's led to our introduction of Caseload Manager to the sector. So for those that don't know Voicescape and who we are, we're an engagement platform. Just trying to jog my slides along. Oh, here we go. We're an engagement platform. So we work with about 70 housing associations up and down the country, predominantly to engage with their community. So if you can think back to your office, you know, there'll be hundreds of people in your offices making outbound telephone calls to your communities for a huge variety of reasons. They might be trying to book a compliance call for their gas boiler. They might be checking in on a vulnerable elderly tenant just to check they're okay. They might be wanting to capture feedback from a repair that you did for them yesterday. Or in this context, they might be wanting to have a conversation with them about rent arrears. And typically that's quite a manual, quite time consuming and inefficient process. So Voicescape have kind of been the sector's answer to that, you know, promoting automation of that engagement. And then the introduction of Caseload Manager brings in recognition. Is the way that we're engaging with people the right way to do it for every single tenant? So the power of voice. Why do we? I think Naomi's talked about, you know, for some tenants, you will not get them on the phone, so use digital. So what we do is we actually use an omni-channel approach, and we use data to understand what's the best way to engage with people. But this is a really simple piece of work that we conducted with Accent Housing, and it was a very simple rent-related message. And that message was, we'd like to speak with you about how you pay your rent. And when we wrote a letter, to Naomi's point, you know, this is a sector that absolutely loves letters, but how many times when we go and visit the tenant do we see those very same letters on the mantelpiece or under the doormat or even in the bin? They got about a 13% response rate. When we text those tenants with the same message, they got about a quarter of tenants responding to them. When we asked officers to pick up the telephone, about 40% of them engaged. But when you combine that, when you give tenants options, you then start to understand their channel preference. You then start to understand what their behavior is. How do they want to engage with their landlord about rent arrears, about booking gas compliance calls, about giving feedback, about delivering TSM messages back? And that's when you start to get into the world of 60, 70, 80% engagement levels, because we're giving people options and we're giving them the chance to let us know through their actions how they want to engage with you. So what do you want to do next time? You want to use that data and empower how you engage with that tenant moving forward. Okay. What I want to do is tell you, oh, here we go. It's a bit of a brag here. So we were proud to be award-winning caseload manager. So it won the Housing Digital Software Product of the Year. I won't read this out to you, and I'm sure Matt will share the slides with you or make them available later on. But you know, for a product in relatively young in its life, only been in the marketplace for about 18 months now, it's won 2 awards. It's won Housing Digital, but also won the KPMG Public Sector Best Digital Transformation Award as well. So I wanted to tell you a story, and I think this really backs up everything Naomi was talking about. So I'd ask you all just to consider who this person might be. They're male, they're British, they're born in 1948, they're wealthy, they live in a castle, they've been married twice, they have children, and they own dogs. Normally at this point, I would ask the audience to a raise of hands who thinks they know who it is. But I know, having done this enough times, that about 50% of you already have worked out that that is indeed King Charles. There you go, that's King Charles. But what if I was also to tell you that it's Ozzy Osbourne? Okay, you might start to recognize that there's a lot of properties there about that person. They're exactly the same. But we know Ozzy and we know Charles. Do we want to engage them in the right way, in the same way? Are there other things about them that maybe suggest to us we should treat them very, very differently? And this is exactly what the psychometric segmentation that Naomi talked about seeks to unpick and understand. We can't start putting people in binary boxes, and rules don't work in this situation. So typically, most landlords will engage with people around rent arrears by doing exactly that, by using rules-based systems, by putting people in binary boxes. We don't use any of this information here. To Naomi's point, these are protected characteristics, and we certainly don't start capturing these unless we're going to use them. But the sorts of information that people do start to use are these. You know, we know all of these things about people, don't we? We know what stage of the escalation they're at, how much money they owe you, where they live, and what their housing benefit status is. But again, you know, a rules-based system would treat Charles and Ozzy in exactly the same way. But we know so much more about those people. We know about how they engage with us. We know about their channel preference. So let's start to use that. And what you'll find is that you start engaging with people at the earliest stages of their arrears escalation in a method that we know is right for them and delivers the right outcomes for both tenant and landlord, and you get much better responses. A highly engaged tenant is a happier tenant and is a more likely to have a long sustainable tenancy with you. So the sorts of data that we know about Charles and Ozzy, as you can see at the top right of my screen, is we know that Charles, we've never tried automated communication with him because he engages really, really well when we pick up the phone or when we send him actually an email. So we can see here that 55, almost 60% of the time that we write Charles an email, he pays us, and he pays us nearly £100 when we do that. But Ozzy, when we write him a letter, it's not a great response, but when we use automated communication, we get much higher rates of engagement. So that's probably what we should do for Ozzy. Okay, so it's that understanding that although lots of the key demographics in the arrears escalation process are exactly the same, we should actually be treating our tenants very, very differently. So a very quick history journey. I'm not sure if many on the call have an income background, but let me just talk a little bit about how we've used this insight and been on a bit of a journey. So if you go back, 10, 12, 15 years, as long as I've been working in social housing income, income officers would have printed off big A3 piece of paper with rulers and highlighter pens, and they'd be going up and down that list saying, who do I need to speak to this week? And what they were finding is there were lots of cases of technical arrears. So people with an arrears balance, but actually they knew from the data they got, housing benefit was due next week, or a direct debit was due, or it's Mrs. Miggins and she always goes into the post office on Tuesday, I'll cross her off my list. And that led to a breed of technology called income analytics. Typically, these were rules-based systems that used if, then, maybe statements to understand which bucket should I put Ozzy and Charles into. But it still left the officers asking that question, what now? How do I best engage with Charles? How do I best engage with Ozzy? So what we do is we break down, take away the rules, and we associate a risk associated with their engagement patterns, associated with their payment patterns, and all of that other information that we know about those tenants. And we actually give officers 3 strands of work. Firstly, the greatest form of efficiency, do nothing. If we can just monitor that case, make sure that there's limited risk with that case, despite the arrears balance and everything else we know about it, we know that they're behaving the way that we want to, do nothing. Then the second greatest form of efficiency is automation. If we can automate that engagement, we know that it's going to deliver the right outcome, and we're using the method that we know is best for that particular tenant, then that's what we will do. And what do I mean by automation? Well, I mean that blend of phone calls, of voicemails, of smart messaging, and we can work with some of the payment providers in the sector, like AllPay, PayPoint, Pay360, and obviously email. What we're doing there is we're giving tenants options. How do you want to engage with us? What's your channel preference? Do you want to speak to an officer? Do you want to text us back? Do you want to just make a payment using a smart link? Do you want to respond to an email? What do you want to do? We're giving you options, but we learn their response to those options over time. But then, and there will be lots of people where that automated engagement is not going to work. It's not the right thing for them. That's when we ask your officers to intervene. But by automating a heavy volume of that work, we're giving them more time so they can spend longer with those tenants that do need more support. So they can have longer, more meaningful conversations. So what? Well, here's the so what. And I think, you know, when we start to show graphs like this, data like this, this is the sort of thing that leads to the growth and adoption of caseload manager in the social housing sector. So this is from our development partner 13, and you can see the huge seismic shift this has made to their arrears debt position. So the first year, you could see there the blue line, their arrears creeping up as they were using their legacy product. They switched us on in December of that year, which is the blue peak. And that initial drop was £800,000 in the first 6 months. And they've consistently kept their arrears at £250,000 below the year before. And that's spilled into this year as well. But the most important thing is they've changed the shape of their debt profile. You can see across the summer, when typically debt increases, they actually reduce their debt over the summer. It did peak at Christmas, but you can see it's a much smaller peak, that yellow peak there. And this year, again, consistently, they reported their lowest debt position ever to the board. They're moving more tenants out of debt and into credit. They're sending more debt over to former tenant debt, and their average UC balance, or their UC payment debt, is about 25% down. So significant impact on all their OKRs across the arrears piece there. And I think when you put all of that into context, you can see why organisations that have hello.
Oh, it's all right. I think someone was just off mute. I've just put them back on mute.
Oh no, it's all right. No, it's fine. I thought it was a question for me. I'm pretty much done now. But it was to say, I think we can start to understand why this new breed of technology supporting that wider understanding that we are squidgy human beings that don't conform to rigid rules and ones and O's, and actually they need to be treated in the way that was going to get the best result for them and the best result for you. So that's me. I'm done. Let's tackle some of those questions that landed for Naomi, but happy to take any myself.
Thank you very, very much, Peter, and thank you to both yourself and Naomi for a real kind of insight. There are some questions in the chat, and I'm aware we've got about 10 minutes. I'm going to come do a whistle stop, and I don't mind which of you want to dive in on them. If anybody would like to bring a question in themselves, please feel free to raise your hand. It'd be lovely to hear from you, and we're welcome to kind of ask questions in person as well. So the first question that came up before you started, Naomi, was actually how can you improve the disability in the data? And I felt you really kind of dove into that in terms of in your presentation. But the next one that came through from Marion was, how do you create buy-in and shift professionals thinking from a focus on collecting data to focusing on making an impact from the start? I think it tied in with a couple of other questions, which is kind of, is this something that, is just for an operational side, or is this like more of a strategic mindset? So thoughts on those?
Yeah, it's a really good question, actually, and it is a strategic mindset. And I think when you look at any of implementation of any of this work, what I always say to people is your two key enablers that have to be in the right space as well are your IT space. Without that, you can't implement it. So that's kind of what we're sort of approaching at the moment. We're doing various pieces of work to be able to operationalize it in different areas. But the first, second most important thing is your culture. And we've actually done the segmentation for our colleagues as well, which is really interesting, to see what actually drives our colleagues, to see what kind of barriers and blocks we've kind of put in place. And that does need to be addressed at the same time. For some people, we're asking them to work in a very, very different way. And it is change is difficult for anyone. For some groups, it's really difficult because I'm trying to empower our colleagues to make the right decision at the right time and to sort of think about that impact rather than following a policy. And some colleagues find that really challenging. They're very used to working in that space of the policy says yes or no, and I need to be told. So you absolutely have to do this hand in hand. You can't just kind of, chuck this into your business and kind of go, there you go, get on with it. You have to have that right culture from the start to be able to start implementing it in the right way.
Sorry, I pressed the wrong button there. No, and couldn't agree more on that. I think culture is a term that comes up nearly every week on the roundtable. Those who've joined us before and those who were at the Southwest Conference and other things that matter, it's something I bang on about all the time. And actually it ties into a question from Honey. What strategic and operational changes have been made based on this additional information at Grand Union? Because those are two very different things to implement. And it actually ties in a bit to a question made recently by Tony Bradley, which is the role of a housing officer wasn't really mentioned in the work we're doing, but I think that's because it affects every strand, doesn't it?
Yeah, so sort of both, because the question was strategic and operational. So strategic, it's definitely sort of, as I said, we used it strategically to redesign our resident involvement approach. We don't do resident involvement anymore. We do proper customer insight. And because of that, we've already seen an uplift in some of our TSMs around listening to customers and actually using their information. We've seen that across all segments, nearly 20% in the last year, because we did that straight away. So kind of those real strategic decisions. We've also used it to frame our IT systems architecture piece. So we're deliberately at the moment starting with a CRM implementation, not a new housing management system, because actually we've sort of seen that that's the most important driver to create the change needed. And we've used it to inform sort of our culture piece as well, which is a current piece of work sort of moving forward. In terms of operationalizing it, we've already sort of made some direct changes. We started by doing a little bit of a restructure to actually sort of merge some teams, because I think, again, some of the processes were quite siloed. So we had, what we call our onboarding team, our tenancy sort of team, completely separate from our voids team. And then there's this massive hole in the middle. From a customer point of view, it's the same process. So we've joined those teams together, and by doing that also kind of created better referrals to our financial wellbeing teams, because what was happening before was our onboarding team was kind of going, yeah, actually this customer's probably going to fall into arrears because they've only got £1.50 left. And it's almost like we watched them kind of until they fell off that cliff and then tried to rescue them, but we make those referrals earlier. We're also using it to inform our void standard. I mean, I'm on a mission that I think it should be better for everybody, but at the moment we don't do kind of this is our home standard where we've assessed need, because there's an algorithm tool coming out of this work. We do a better home standard where there is a need for it, and we'll carpet and we'll decorate and we'll sort of do other things. And obviously we're working at the moment specifically in our arrears environment as well to start really sort of embedding that kind of well-being sort of ethos for all of our communications. So starting with those messages of, hi, Mrs. Miggins, we've noticed you've missed a payment. Is everything okay? Rather than, you owe us money, kind of, being a bit kind of blunt,
housing officers to get ahead of the game, which is absolutely key. And the next question actually ties in with, it might be better for Peter, it might be, I don't know who's going to be better for this one, but how do these customer profiles map out onto the CRM itself? So how do you know which profile a customer belongs to when they contact you? Is there a general data insight to form strategy? How is that working? Because evidently we talked before, as you mentioned, not everyone's in a box, but then there are areas we need to make sure.
Shall I answer that, Peter?
Yeah,
just you can talk about your sort of system. But so this is not about labeling. You don't need to know if Mrs. Miggins is in nurture, assist, or whatever. You don't need to do that. There's two strands we're doing at the moment. So this is about embedding that inclusion. If we design, so to give you an example, we used to test our policies with customers, those engaged customer groups. They'd tell us, yeah, that's great, understand it. We've got now a mechanism to test it with all of those customer groups. And we've done our damp and mold policy, and we've just done our ASB policy. What we found through that, because we've got highlighting tools, we've got a really sophisticated toolkit we can actually sort of roll out to customers, we could see that Deliver and Flex absolutely understood the 6-page document. Nurture didn't, Reassure didn't, nobody did it. So we're redesigning our policies and all our documentation to meet the needs of Reassure and Nurture. It still works for Deliver. So we've got a much simpler infographic.
Do people on your system then move between the different profiles when you're
no.
How do you know? I guess
you don't need to know.
Okay.
You don't need to know, because if you design for the person with the most difficulty, it works for everybody, and that's what's adopted for everybody. So we don't send.
Just try everything and realize over time
trial
who responds
test
to most.
Exactly. So when it comes to that direct operationalization with like caseload manager, we just work on that individual, so we know what that individual needs for part of that process. But on systems, kind of that main overarching strategic design, if we can see that we've got 10% failure because we've got a process where we're writing to customers, we're stopping that process and redesigning it to meet the needs of everybody. What we are doing as a separate strand to that, I should say, is the development of a priority services register, so which you get quite a lot in other sectors. You may or may not be aware of this at the moment, especially in financial services. A lot of their focus is on consumer duty. They have to sort of actually demonstrate how they're kind of meeting the needs of vulnerable customers. So we're doing a specific piece of work to define what we mean by vulnerability, where we will give an enhanced offer based on that criteria. And then that will have to be an opt-in explicit consent for customers to join that, and they will be flagged on the system as part of that register. But you don't need to know kind of what profile a customer has, because they won't fit neatly into that box anyway. You just need to design your services to be more inclusive, and it will meet the needs of the majority of your customers.
Brilliant. Pete, I'm going to bring you in on it.
Yeah.
I'm just going to say, because a couple of people have said they're going to have to go, feel free if you need to. This is being recorded. It'll be up on the YouTube channel by the end of the day. So if you do have asked a question and it's in there and you want it answered, we will make sure questions get answered. I understand if you've got to bounce. I know, Naomi, you've got another meeting too, so we're going to be as quick as we can. But Peter, over to you.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think I just wanted to pick up on the Naomi's point there. We also are firm believers you don't need to record that in CRM, because and Tony's just joined the dots for us there. A case for AI, methinks, absolutely, and that's what's at the heart of Caseload Manager. It's artificial intelligence that's making those hundreds of decisions, joining those dots for officers to understand this is the best form of engagement at this stage of escalation for this particular tenant. This is what I'm going to do. Take it away from the officer, so that the officer then has the benefit of time to spend with those tenants that do need that the extra bit of love, extra bit of care, and extra bit of time from the housing officers or the income officers. And the other thing I would say to that is it's been transformation, the shift for the officers' working day. So many of our customers are generic housing officers models, and what they've been able to do is reduce the amount of time they're spending on rent arrears, because they're not doing the laborious, mundane tasks of looking at case after case after case. They're spending time doing the things that they love, the things that they're trained to do and they're good at, which is supporting tenants in rent arrears. So the case of 13 Group, their officers were spending 2 days out of 5 on income collection. They now spend 1. So the other 4 days, they're back out. They're spending more time on patch. They're spending more time supporting tenants on the streets, knocking on doors. And it's been absolutely transformational in their job satisfaction. We've got data that supports their system preference and their job satisfaction since using Caseload Manager, because they're getting to do more of what they're good at.
And also because then you're more embedded in that culture of we're actually here to help, and what we are doing is helping. Andrew Hart had said, inspiring view on customers and what should really be done. We agree the sector is so behind. I think the main problem is we're so busy we don't look to adapt, and that's exactly it. We're so busy doing the same old that we haven't got time to look at the other side. I couldn't agree with you more. Matt Beta, how does this approach link with the Ombudsman expectation that we do gather specific customer demographic information? I had a conversation with a rep from the Ombudsman last week where the explicit understanding was that we analyse internal complaint data by protected characteristic, and this would be increasingly expected from April 24. Thoughts on that one, Naomi?
So we've shared this with the Ombudsman, and we've told them we'll be doing things differently, and we're also making different decisions for different customers where there's a different impact. Our decisions on those complaints will be different depending on what that individual impact will be. And we are sort of demonstrating and evidencing through this work that we don't need to do it sort of by that level. We have questions built into that process for complaints which picks up on difficulty, need, capability, and impact, and that's how we'll be kind of reporting that. So otherwise you kind of fall into that trap again of why collecting that data. It's a real problem, I think, for us in the sector at the moment, because unless you're doing anything with that, you shouldn't be collecting it anyway, and you won't get that information from everybody, and it doesn't tell you anything about what they need or the impact sort of direct way. But there's ways of capturing it as part of a process, but you're not storing in your systems.
I think the key thing there is that you're working with the Ombudsman, and that's the answer. If anybody was at the CIH Southwest conference, I had the honour really of kind of interviewing them and holding the panel on them, and they said our job is to hold up a mirror, and if you've got ideas, we want to hear them. So exactly that. Paula, I think thank you for sharing your insight. I really think this is a similar picture across the board for many housing organisations, especially post-COVID. And Katie Bird, I think this is really interesting in terms of the Housing Ombudsman Spotlight report on knowledge and information management, focusing on the data you already hold on your system. It'd be good to see if this approach was used by them to demonstrate how we can realistically achieve the best outcomes for customers. A couple more points, but we are out of time. I just want to thank Naomi and Peter for a really, really interesting insight into what can actually be done to maybe make a change, what is happening, what isn't happening. I know both of you are on LinkedIn and always open for questions and things along those lines, so do please reach out. And also what's really great is that next week our roundtable was focused around Neil Goodrich, who's going to be bringing the of TSMs to the table and really kind of having more of an in-depth look at that, so it ties in wonderfully. I just want to thank you both for a huge amount of information, which I hope everyone's got the chance to digest. But as I say, the recordings will go live. If you want to get in touch with me about roundtables through the course of this year or next year, please do. But for now, Peter, Naomi, thank you so much. And I really look forward to hearing kind of more feedback on what comes of today, because I think there's going to be a lot of ways that people can take what we learned today and really move forward with it.
Okay,
Yeah,
thanks,
thank you,
everybody.
Matt. Yeah, thank you.
You're very, very welcome. Thanks all, and hopefully see you next week. Take care.
Thank you.